All right. So I'm going to be speaking about translating incompleteness in Kazuo Ishiguro's fiction. I entitled this communication "The Missing Fragments in the Mosaic," and I will tell you why. So this is Kazuo Ishiguro, looking very smug. I worked on the translation of his novels during my PhD, and I was focusing more specifically on a translation of silence. Hence the notion of missing fragments, because in Ishiguro's writing, typically you have an unreliable narrator, which doesn't tell you everything you would ideally want to know as a reader. I was working on 4 novels. So the first one, The Famous Remains of the Day, which got the Booker Prize, The Inconsult, and the one before last, The Buried Giant. After which he got the Nobel Prize in 2017. And there's a new one out now, which I highly recommend, Clara in the Sun. Okay, so unreliable narration, narration non fiable in French. So for those who may not be familiar with the concept, which is more from narrative poetics, it's when the implicit writer sort of like deliberately inscribes into the text a false testimony, if you like, of the narrator. So the narrator doesn't say everything, as I mentioned before, and you have textual clues that help you fill in the blanks, so to speak, and that points to the limits of the narrative, so that the reader is a sort of detective. So, for instance, in the first novel, towards the end, there is a confusion in the pronouns, and the narrator says "we" instead of "you," and this is a sort of confirmation that she's actually not the person she's saying she is, just to make it simple. So Booth described unreliable narration as a secret collusion between implied author and implied reader behind the narrator's back, and I like this image. And what I'm going to focus on today is how this is a challenge for translators. Translating a text where silence and ambiguity are a full part of the poetics, of the aesthetics of the text. This is a challenge because the translator has to reproduce the blank, ideally, would reproduce the blank so as to reproduce a similar poetics of silence, but without filling them in. And this sort of goes precisely against what translation is about, which is making the reader understand something that wasn't understandable, to give them access to the source text. So here the question is, how do you give access to the source text with its subtexts without making them more either accessible, more present, or without losing them altogether, which is the other obvious risk. So the first challenge is to identify the subtext. You could always, in a lot of cases with Ishiguro, it is actually very possible to translate without having noticed or analyzed the subtle clues in the narrator's discourse, and to still reproduce them by chance, just with a fairly literal translation. But it's not always the case. And the second challenge is, of course, rendering these blanks without filling them. And this is particularly difficult for a translator, or particularly tricky, because of what Becher calls the increased communicative risk for a translator as compared to an author. So this is what he says. Since translators are paid for linguistic mediation, that is to say, for achieving understanding, they are always the prime suspects when communication problems occur. And accordingly, it is not surprising that translators will go to great lengths to ensure understanding. And this is where explicitation comes into play. Explicitation is one of the bases for possibly the most well-known universal de traduction, translation universal, the explicitation hypothesis, put forward by Blum-Kulke in 1986. And the goal of my work was to test this hypothesis, which states that translations tend to be more explicit than the source text. So the goal was to test this hypothesis on novels characterized by unreliable narration. That is to say, novels where the implicit plays a prominent role in the first place. So I'll talk you through two very specific examples. I don't have time for more, but hopefully that will give you an idea of what I was looking at. The first is taken from A Pale View of Hills, so the first novel written by Ishiguro. And as I mentioned before, in this novel, the narrator's identity is a bit blurred. It actually overlaps with that of another main character, her friend, called Sashiko. So the narrator and her friend seem to be, on the surface, they are two different people, but there are more and more clues throughout the book that this friend might be actually a projection from the narrator, and they're actually the same person. And I'm going to show you a passage where you get the very first clues, according to me, but every time I reread the book, I find different ones, so possibly I've left out quite a few. So this first clue is only really a clue in retrospect, or if you are a nerd and pore over it like I did for months on end. I doubt it would catch anyone's attention at first reading, but you never know, it's still part of the text. And it's subtext. So I'm not going to read you the whole passage. I'm just going to tell you that in this passage, the narrator is listening to a conversation about her friend, her new neighbor. So the conversation is supposed to be about this Sashiko woman, but her name is never said. And this is a recurrent device in Ishiguro's writing. So when the identity is blurred, instead of using a name, the characters start using pronouns or paraphrase, and this is what we have here. So you see we have the woman, the newcomer, she, the stranger, and then the stranger. So the name is never pronounced. So looking at the translation into French for this first example, what we can see, so this is a translation by Sophie Mayou, we can see that the subtext is actually transferred, because we do not have the name. In the Spanish translation, for instance, I think it's in this passage that we do have the name, or in a very similar passage. So sometimes this is not reproduced in the translation, but here we only have paraphrases and pronouns. We do not have proper names. So it's fair to say that the subtext has actually been transferred, so that someone analyzing the text or looking for clues would find a similar clue. Now, whether this was conscious or not, I have no idea. Because of things later in the text, I suspect maybe not, but that's the beauty of Ishiguro's writing. As I said, you can very often transfer without meaning to. So still on this first example, in the following paragraph, we get a second clue to this overlap of identity between the narrator and the woman that we're talking about here, Sashiko. And here, this ambiguity is not fostered through avoidance and paraphrase so much as repetition, on the contrary, insistence. So what we have here is that over these two paragraphs, the one we've looked at and the new one here at the bottom, you have the same word recurring 3 times, unfriendly, used twice talking about Sashiko on the surface. And once there is this switch to the I, which is slightly unaccountable in the text, and once for the narrator. And this, in my opinion, in my analysis, connects the two women. So the question obviously is, could this not be a coincidence? And I would say no, and I'm fairly convinced, because with Ishiguro, nothing is ever a coincidence. And there doesn't tend to be this kind of repetition, and certainly not at random like this. But I looked at the French translation, and we had 3 different translations for unfriendly: guerre sociable, peu amicale, and insociable. Chesterman talks about, in his 2010, I think, work, talks about repetition reduction as another universal of translation. And this is particularly relevant for translations into French, because French as a language just doesn't like repetitions very much, especially in literary texts. It doesn't really flow, it doesn't really work that well. The literary norms are a lot stricter, I think, in French for repetition than they are in English. So it's not necessarily a surprise that the translator would have chosen to do this if they didn't pick up on the subtext, which really we cannot blame her for, I think. So I think that in particular, the choice of the word insociable, which is a really unusual word, I'm not sure I've seen it before. I think this is a confirmation, if anything, that there is a conscious effort to avoid repetition, so that the translator did notice that repetition, but discounted it as not meaningful. And this takes me to Antoine Berman's notion of deforming tendencies. Now, this is a very prescriptive word, which I didn't like that much, but it's very useful for analyzing this kind of thing. So what he talks about is destruction of underlying networks of meaning. And here's what he says about it. A literary work contains a hidden dimension, an underlying text where certain signifiers correspond and link up, forming all sorts of networks beneath the surface of the text itself. If such networks are not transmitted, a signifying process in the text is destroyed. So a more descriptive approach could maybe speak of disappearance or implicitation rather than destruction, which sounds very malicious. But in any case, this implicitation that we have here, the passage from a meaningful repetition to different synonyms, it can make the subtext actually harder to access for the reader, because this meaning, this underlying meaning or clue has disappeared. And so paradoxically, this can increase the degree of ambiguity at the scale of the novel. Even though the passage is maybe normalized, it does amount to the disappearance of a clue, and they do add up over the novel. Okay, so I want to show you here a paper that I looked at when I was doing archival work at the Harrison Center. And this is when where I went to check all my ideas that I had beforehand. For instance, is it on purpose that we don't have the name Sashiko here? Is it on purpose that the word unfriendly comes up again and again? And what I did find is that there is some rewriting going on. So between newcomer and woman on the fourth line, there is a change here. And if you look at the one before last line, there's also a hesitation between woman and stranger, but unfriendly is untouched, including further down, and you can't see it here, but trust my word, it's untouched elsewhere too. And so I think we get a sense looking at this of how much each word and each comma is thought through, and how nothing is left to chance. And that there have been changes, but the word Sashiko never was an option, so the writer never considered using the name. And I think this tends to confirm this notion that it's a meaningful part of the text. Okay, so that was my first example. I'll try to be quicker in a second. So Remains of the Day is very famous, but I'll still give you a bit of context. We have a butler, Stevens, who's traveling, wearing the clothes and using the car of his employer. And he's very self-conscious, very class-conscious. And he realizes that people keep mistaking him for a lord. And he gets very flattered about that. Because of his clothes and his car, people think he is a lord, and he likes it, but he does not want to clear the misunderstanding, but also doesn't want to lie to their face. And you get that sense because he's always avoiding direct questions and trying to keep the ambiguity on. And so there is a passage where he goes to an inn, and his car has broken down, or rather his boss's car has broken down. And so someone asks him the following question when he asks for help with his car. Your car would be the vintage Ford up there on Thornley Bush Hill, sir. If that is the hill road overlooking this village, I said. So it's not really his car, it's his employer's. And this is his chance to say it, but he doesn't. what he does is leave this unfinished sentence. So we have in this, the main clause really of this conditional form is missing, because what we'd expect is, if that is the car overlooking the hill overlooking this village, then yes, this is my car. This is what we would expect, or something equivalent. But this is implied here, it's not spelled out, which allows Stevens to stay clear, nominally clear of a lie, without admitting that the car is not really his. And this corresponds to what Heltai calls a grammatical ellipsis. And this again is very significative in the poetics of the text. And so I looked at the Turkish translation for this. Söz ettiğiniz tepe bu köyü kuş bakışı gören o yamaçsa, evet. Sorry for my pronunciation. And so my translation, approximate again, here is that if the hill you're referring to, etc., yes, we have this evet at the end, which is very definite. But then what we have to take into account is that in Turkish, it was really tricky grammatically to have a functional sentence without the omitted second part, without the missing part in English, the missing part of the hypothesis. Without the evet, the sentence doesn't work that well. And so here I would speak of what Claudie calls an obligatory explicitation, dictated not by a stylistic choice, for instance, but more by the structure of the language. So it's still an explicitation, but it's not necessarily avoidable. But if we look at the Spanish, si se refiere a la colina desde la que se divisa el pueblo, sí es el mío. If you're referring to the hill from which the village is visible, yes, it is mine. And here, Spanish, just like English or French, had the option of leaving out the second part. It makes for a slightly odd sentence, just like in English, but it's very, very possible. But what is certain is that we did not have to have es el mío, it is mine. So here, we could say that not only is the translator filling in the missing fragment of the mosaic of the text, they're actually sort of highlighting it, making it extra conspicuous. So definitely a non-obligatory explicitation. My guess is that the translator didn't pick up on this subtext, and again, fair enough, that it's extremely subtle. But here again, what Antoine Berman talks about in this kind of case is clarification, which makes clear what was not and did not want to be clear in the original. And this raises an interesting question of what does this mean? Did not want to be clear? Does the text have a will of its own? Is it the same as the authors? Is it the narrators? How can we access it? So this is really what I was trying to do when I went to the archive and looked at the genesis of the text. I was really trying to see what is the text wanting to do. And this is not about blaming the translators or giving brownie points for who leaves the blank and who doesn't. I'm really trying to see what happens and why. And my guess here is that in many of the cases I looked at, the blanks are filled. And my guess here is that very simply, for lack of time, lack of analysis, broadly speaking, like these are nuances of the text that have not been that researched. And so my guess is that it's just not very realistic to expect that such subtleties would translate, especially in languages where the structure is a little bit different. So in conclusion, different languages have different linguistic constraints and literary norms, and this is one of the explanations for the different translation strategies that we've seen. There's many more, of course. And at the scale of a sentence, filling in the missing fragment of a text can improve the reading processability, can improve readability, if you like, but it can also make the underlying narrative less accessible at the scale of the whole novel. So there's a two-sky kind of thing going on here, which I had to deal with in my work again and again. This is easier at the level of the sentence, but at the level of the text, it's less coherent. And generally, my findings tend to support Bloom-Kulka's explicitation hypothesis in the context of narrative poetics. And I do believe that they reflect this increased communicative risk for the translator. So not only what I said before about the sheer difficulty of identifying the subtext and of finding an adequate solution, but also the fact that maybe there was this notion that it might be blamed on a translator, the ambiguity, the unstylish repetition of a word, etc. So these are my conclusions. This is my take on the different translations, and I hope you enjoyed it.